There's been a lot of papers that focus on the return to sport process, but very few focus on returning to performance, and in particular returning to peak performance. So what I'd like to do in this next video is explain the return to sport process following hamstring injury and what this means for returning to peak performance. Importantly, I'd like to give you some tips on how we can ensure our athletes not only return to sport, but get back to their peak levels of performance. So, in this paper, our central question was, does returning to sport equate to returning to peak performance? And what we did was looked at a group of football players who had sustained hamstring strain injury. And we quantified their high speed running before the injury and following return to the sport. We only had 15 athletes, but this is a summary of those results. This is high speed running pre-injury. The vertical line in the middle of the graph represents the time of injury, and then to the right of that graph represents the high speed running performed after the athletes had returned to competition following injury. Now, the first thing you'll see here is that there's a red trend line through the data, and that red trend line is relatively flat on the left portion of the curve. So it indicates that high speed running is quite stable prior to injury. And you can also see that the error bars associated with those box plots are quite small, indicating that there's not a lot of variability in high speed running from game to game. However, when we return our athletes to competition following injury, two things you can see here. One is there's much greater variability in high speed running. Those error bars are much greater. And secondly, the trend line is trending down. Out of our 15 athletes, 7 of those athletes were unable to return to the pre-injury high speed running performance, indicating that almost half of our athletes didn't return to peak performance pre-injury levels. So there's obviously something that's falling down in the rehab process. It's either in the early stage rehab process or the late stage rehab process, or maybe it's somewhere in the middle, the grey area between early stage rehab and return to peak performance. But let's look a little bit closer into the demands of sprinting and what actually happens with sprinting. Now, this is some data that looked at the effect of changes in speed, so different speeds and how this changes the work that's done at different joints, so the hip, knee, and ankle joint. Now, when these athletes increased the speed, there wasn't a lot of change in the work done at the ankle joint, but the main changes occurred in terms of the negative work done at the knee joint and the positive work done at the hip joint. And these changes only really occurred when the athletes approached maximum speeds. So what it tells us is that sprinting is a different type of load than any other type of locomotion. When we ask our athletes to sprint, the work done at the hip and the work done at the knee increases exponentially. It changes exponentially. And what we also know is that the hamstrings, particularly the biceps femoris, is most active in the late swing phase of sprinting. Now, this is important information because it informs how we go about our rehab process following hamstring strain injury. So if we look at a wide range of exercises that athletes perform during the rehab process. Now, these are exercises designed as isolated hamstring exercises on the left. Now, there's a series of different exercises, 7 different exercises that these authors looked at in terms of muscle activation. So they had a lying kick out where athletes would lie on the ground and then kick their leg up in the air. They had a standing kick out. Then they progressed to a Nordic exercise that just had the eccentric component, the down phase. Then they had a Nordic return, so an eccentric and concentric um, phase of the Nordic exercise. They progressed these to what they called crane exercises, or some people call these a razor curl. And they had two types of these crane or razor curl exercises, one that only had the eccentric phase, and then a second one that included the eccentric and concentric phase, the return phase. And then the final exercise is a weighted Nordic exercise. So it involved holding a weight, increasing the length of the lever to hopefully increase the activation on the hamstring muscles. Now, what they did on the right was looked at hamstring activation. Now, we're going to look predominantly at biceps femoris because that's the hamstring muscle that tends to be the most stressed in late swing phase, and it tends to be the one that tears most commonly. These authors expressed hamstring activation relative to sprinting speeds. So they called sprinting speed 100% activation, and they expressed everything else relative to that. And you can see with these 7 different exercises, none of the exercises approached the activation that we see in sprinting. So there's 2 things to take away here, and that is that performing these isolated hamstring exercises, while important to restore local tissue capacity, then they're not going to approach anywhere near the type of muscle activation that we get in sprinting. And the second thing to keep in mind is that nothing prepares our athletes to sprint like sprinting. But there's also a third thing to keep in mind here, and that is that we can't just go from an injured hamstring where we've got damage to the tissue and then expect our athletes to be able to sprint. We need to instill some of these exercises, these isolated hamstring exercises, as building blocks, as the foundation for higher intensity work. So these isolated hamstring exercises, while they don't approach the 100% of maximum sprinting speed and the muscle activation that we see in sprinting, they are still important to as groundwork or as the building blocks to prepare us or prepare our athletes to be able to sprint. So then if we're thinking about local tissue loading and how that relates to sport-specific loading, I've presented this framework before where we consider the interplay between local tissue loading and sport-specific loading, or local tissue capacity and sport-specific capacity. Now, if we take the top left-hand quadrant of this graph, where we have an over-focus on sport-specific capacity, this is great in terms of having our athletes prepared for sporting activities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our athletes have good local tissue health. Now, when we have an athlete who sustains an injury, so they go into the bottom left-hand quadrant of this graph, local tissue capacity drops immediately due to pain, inflammation, changes in range of motion. And if we don't continue loading, sport-specific capacity will follow with it. It's important in this phase that we give the tissue time for biological healing. We can't cheat biological healing time. But it's also important to try and load early so that we can restore local tissue capacity. So the emphasis in this early stage is on local tissue loading. But we also need to keep in mind that if all we do is focus on local tissue loading, then we potentially restore local tissue health. We have good local tissue health. But if we neglect sport-specific loading, we're going to be underprepared for the demands of competition. So as rehab practitioners, we need to be thinking, let's raise the floor of local tissue loading, but let's not neglect sport-specific loading. So the good programs will have a focus on both good local tissue loading and regular touches of sport-specific capacity within the framework of respecting biological healing time. So how would that look for our return to hamstring? This is the exact same schematic, looking at local tissue loading and how it interplays with sport-specific capacity. But now what I'm doing is building a framework for hamstring rehabilitation. So when we have an injured athlete with a hamstring strain injury, our first priority is to decrease the effusion, to increase the range of motion, to increase isometric strength. And then we want to try and load as within the constraints of local tissue capacity. So we want to try and normalize gait. We want to increase neuromuscular control, increase strength, and then we start becoming a little bit more sport specific in our loading. We want to increase eccentric strength and build in accelerations and decelerations into our program. Before returning our athlete to play, we want to make sure we tick off the boxes for sport specific loading. So we want to improve muscular endurance. We want to improve power. We definitely want to expose our athlete to high speed running and sprinting and sport specific skill. So to summarize, if we want to get our athletes out of rehab and back to peak performance, then of course we need to respect biological healing time. We can't cheat biological healing time. It is what it is. But we need to load and load early. We need to restore local tissue capacity, restore local tissue health, but also build in sport-specific loading, regular doses of higher intensity sport-specific work to ensure that when our athletes return to competition, they have both good local tissue health and good sport-specific capacity so that they can handle the demands of competition. So you can see that returning to sport doesn't necessarily mean returning to performance. Hopefully you can see from this video that there is a need to keep loading our athletes in rehab and exposing them to the demands of competition. If we can do that on a regular basis, then it gives those athletes the best chance of returning to peak performance, returning to competition, and remaining injury-free.